Here follows one of the last notes in the Red Book. We have heard tell that Legolas took Gimli, Glowing's son, with him, because of their great friendship, greater than any that has been between elf and dwarf. Greetings and well met, my friends. Yoyston here, and I hope you all are doing well, wherever you are in Middle-earth. It is undeniable that many of us are facing some tough times right now, and many of us are missing our friends and families. I know I am. I count myself very fortunate indeed to be able to continue discussing Tolkien's works every week with you all in our Men of the West community, and I count you all to be my friends. In the theme of friendship and continuing forth together to see the dawn, I wanted to discuss a tale of friendship today. Many of you chose on our latest poll for us to discuss Legolas and Gimli, and I am glad for that. While this video will not explore their individual lives fully, it will discuss the story regarding the two of them together. I have other videos pertaining to them and their stories individually, and I will link them in the description and cards above, along with some related articles that helped in the creation of today's video. I do need to update the Legolas video at some point soon, so I will replace the link when the time comes. My friends, without further delay, thank you all for joining me today. Let us begin our tale. Legolas Greenleaf, son of Thranduil of the woodland realm of Mirkwood, and Gimli, son of Glowing of the Blue Mountains and later the Lonely Mountain, met in the year 3018 of the Third Age in Rivendell. They had come to take part in the Council of Elrond, where many fates became one and stories were told. As we know, they both became the representatives of their peoples within the Fellowship of the Ring, Legolas for the elves and Gimli for the dwarves. The two did not really interact with one another much until they had come near to the doors of Durin of Khazad-dûm, for Gandalf mentioned how the west door had been made in a time of trade and mingling between folk of different race, between dwarves and elves. Gimli said it was not the fault of the dwarves, and Legolas replied he had not heard it was the fault of the elves as to why the friendship had waned. Gandalf said he had heard both, and begged the two to be friends and to help him. Indeed, while I explore this further in a video about why the two kindreds disliked each other, I should speak to this a bit here, as Legolas and Gimli had a lot to overcome if they were to be friends. While there were many differences, ranging from personalities to societies between elves and dwarves, there are some chief reasons as to why the two peoples distrusted and even disliked one another. One is that in the Elder Days, King Thingol of Doriath employed the aid of dwarves in crafting a Silmaril into the Nauglamir, and he was slain over this object by dwarves, not of the Longbeards, I should add. However, there was war between elves and dwarves in that time after the death of Thingol. Another reason is that the dwarves delved too deeply in Khazad-dûm, awakening Durin's Bane, which ended the friendship between the dwarves of Moria and the elves of Lothlorien. For the dwarves were driven out, and the elves became fearful of Moria, and the terror that dwelt within. Finally, and most recently in the timeline, the elves of Thranduil, the great elven king, Legolas's father, had captured Thorin's company, a company of which Gimli's father Glowing had been a part, and they almost came to blows during the Battle of Five Armies, some short time later. There was not just animosity between elves of the Woodland Realm and dwarves of the Lonely Mountain, but it was a conflict between most all elves and dwarves because of these many historical events. All of these things, and others besides, played a role in how Legolas and Gimli innately saw one another, and how they judged each other. They would have to overcome these shadows of the past and accept their cultural differences if they were to be friends. Now, getting back to our story, while the words of Gandalf seemed to have an impact, the problems could not be so easily mended. However, during the Battle of the Chamber of Mizarbul, Legolas had to drag Gimli out of the chamber to escape doom. After the fall of Gandalf in Moria and some more journeying, Legolas told the lay of Nimrodel, and he spoke of the evil in Moria, of which Gimli preemptively stated the dwarves did not create. Legolas responded that he never said it was so. Legolas, at least, would not blame the dwarves for Durin's Bane, especially having seen him himself, in the same way Celeborn might. Later, Legolas vouches for Gimli as his companion to the elves of Haldir's company of Lothlorien. The elves assigned responsibility of the dwarf to Legolas and Aragorn, and claimed that the dwarf alone of the company would have to walk blindfolded through the secret paths on their way to Lorien. While Legolas did not argue this point, when the time came for Gimli to be blindfolded, he would not have it. The dwarf claimed he would not betray the elves of Lorien any sooner than he would betray Legolas, or the rest of the company in fact. Before Gimli came to blows with Haldir and his elves, and after Legolas cried a plague on the stiff necks of the dwarves, Aragorn negotiated a new idea, that all of the Fellowship would be blindfolded as to not single Gimli out. To this Gimli laughed, and said he would be content if only Legolas shared in his blindness, and in turn Legolas grew angry, and Aragorn said that they should now cry, "A plague on the stiff necks of the elves." But they all did walk blindfolded, until a time when messages came from the Lord and Lady of the Galadhrim, stating that all of them, Gimli included, could walk free. It is important to note that, at least in part, it is due to Lady Galadriel that more trust was allotted to Gimli from the elves, and he was the first dwarf to see Lothlorien in many a year. Once the company came to the Lord and Lady, and Gimli saw the beauty and heard the sympathies of the Lady Galadriel, there was a change. It was under the golden leaves of Lorien where Gimli's heart was opened to the beauties of the Eldar, and Legolas, among many other elves, grew to understand the dwarves better. In many ways, I think we have Galadriel to thank for this change, for she helped Celeborn understand the plight of the dwarves, whose sadness laid in Khazad-dûm, and she spoke to Gimli with words of his tongue of Khazad-dûm, showing understanding. Gimli came to have a great affection for her, and at their parting, Galadriel told all elves who would hear to not say dwarves were grasping and ungracious, for Gimli at first asked for no gift from her. Perhaps it was with her words, understanding, and gift of 3 golden hairs that the elves of that land, and Legolas himself, came to understand the virtue of Gimli the dwarf. If nothing else, Galadriel fostered the land that Legolas and Gimli together would explore, for after arriving at Caras Galadhon, Legolas often went abroad in that land, and took Gimli with him, much to the surprise of the company. And they became friends even before Galadriel gave her gift to Gimli. Indeed, even at the end of our story, we shall see how Galadriel factored into Gimli's choice to go with Legolas to the Undying Lands. It seems that Galadriel, and especially her land of Lothlorien, under the protection of Nenya, the Ring of Adamant, were instrumental in bringing Legolas and Gimli together as not only friends, but seemingly best friends. After their stay in Lorien, the two would ride in the same boat down the River Anduin, and Gimli would confide in his fast friend, saying he had taken the worst wound from the parting away from Lorien and Galadriel, and if Elrond had told him of such peril of light and joy, he would not have come. Legolas said alas for all of them, and counted Gimli to be blessed, for he chose to suffer such a loss, and might have chosen otherwise, but did not forsake his companions, and continued with them. The memory of Lorien would stay with him, forever unfading. As the Fellowship journeyed down the River Anduin, Legolas would shoot down a fell beast in the sky, and Gimli would praise the bow of Galadriel and the skill of Legolas. During the discussion of the company's future, Legolas and Gimli were like-minded in their thoughts, both saying that they would vote to go to Minas Tirith as a company, but that they would not abandon Frodo. Legolas says, quote, "It would be faithless now to say farewell," end quote. In my mind, this echoes Gimli's statement to Elrond earlier in the book, quote, "Faithless is he that says farewell when the road darkens," end quote. After Boromir returned and recounted Frodo's disappearance, Gimli and Legolas ran off to look for him. They would return to Parth Galen after the death of Boromir, coming to Aragorn, who was with him. Once they had a funeral and sang their farewell to their friend, Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli became the 3 hunters to look for Merry and Pippin. Eventually they came to Éomer's band, and after Éomer insulted the Lady Galadriel, and Gimli insulted Éomer back, the exchange came nearly to blows, for Legolas stood with Gimli in his brashness, claiming that he would slay Éomer before he could strike Gimli. Once more, the words of Aragorn diffused the situation, and the 3 continued together, with horses from Éomer as gifts. Legolas and Gimli both rode on the horse Arod. After meeting Gandalf the White in Fangorn, and hearing that the hobbits were safe, Legolas and Gimli would continue on with Aragorn and Gandalf. Once Gandalf saved Theoden from the treachery of Wormtongue, it was time for the Rohirrim to ride to war. And Gimli rode with Éomer, a new friend of his, but he would only do so if his comrade Legolas rode beside him. Eventually, at the bidding of Gandalf, Theoden's host made for Helm's Deep. Gimli was more at home in the Fortress of Stone than on horseback, and Legolas was comforted to have his friend there with him for the siege to come. And so the 2 friends fought at the Battle of Helm's Deep, keeping count of the kills they made. At the end of the battle, Gimli had won by 1 count, sitting pretty at 42 kills. He outscored Legolas, but the elf was so glad to see his friend who had been separated away from him during the battle that he did not grudge Gimli the game. During their ride upon Arod to Isengard, Gimli told Legolas of the caves of Helm's Deep, Aglarond, the Glittering Caves. He depicted to Legolas the beauty of them, wishing to bring dwarves there to tend them. He moved Legolas in such a way that Legolas struck a bargain with the dwarf, that after the war they should together walk the Fangorn and then the caves of Helm's Deep. Gimli agreed to suffer Fangorn if Legolas would see the caves. As they continued through the trees, Legolas saw eyes in them and rode off to meet them, much to Gimli's surprise and fear. They went on to Isengard after discovering the Ents, and reunited with their hobbit friends. The two served as representatives of their kinds in meeting with Saruman after the Ents had drowned Isengard, and Legolas would introduce Gimli to Treebeard, stating Gimli's axe was for orcs and not trees. Treebeard remarked that it was a strange friendship. Legolas said that while Gimli lived, he would not come to the Fangorn alone. Soon after all of this, the Grey Company came from the north, and Legolas and Gimli continued on with Aragorn, the Dunedain of the north, and the Sons of Elrond, going to the paths of the dead and beyond. Legolas passed under the mountain when Gimli stood outside, yet afraid and astonished that an elf would go underground when a dwarf would not. He soon mustered up the courage to do so, even if only to follow Aragorn. And that they did, and they witnessed Aragorn fulfill some of his destiny, commanding the Oathbreakers across southwest Gondor, coming to Pelargir and defeating the Corsairs. After the Oathbreakers were released from their service, Legolas and Gimli followed their captain to the Pelennor, coming up the Undying River. After the Battle of the Pelennor Fields, Gimli and Legolas walked the streets of Minas Tirith. Gimli commented on the stonework of the city that might be improved with his folk, and Legolas, of the same tone, regarded the small amount of nature, saying that his folk would bring birds and trees. Such things would happen when Aragorn came into his own. The two encountered Prince Imrahil and relayed a message from Aragorn. After Imrahil departed, the two had an interesting aside concerning men and their works, to which Legolas said to Gimli that the deeds of men shall outlast them. It's quite an interesting conversation concerning how the elf and dwarf spoke of men, ere the age of men came. The two went on to see Merry and Pippin once more, and Legolas told of how the sea had called to him. Gimli and the hobbits were saddened to think of their friend leaving Middle-earth, and Merry claimed that there would always be folk, even wise dwarves like Gimli, who need him. Then they told the hobbits of their journey from the paths of the dead through to Pelargir and coming up the Anduin River. Soon it was time for more battle, and Legolas and Gimli went with the host of the West, going once more as representatives of their folk, along with many others, to meet with the messenger of Mordor at the Black Gate. Then came the battle, and the West had victory over Sauron, for the One Ring was destroyed. And so it was the Fellowship was reunited, dwelling for a time in Gondor, before they headed northwards once more. Legolas and Gimli came again to Helm's Deep, riding as ever upon Arod, so they took to exploring the caverns of Aglarond first. Legolas had not the words to describe the beauty of the caves, saying Gimli was the first dwarf to claim victory over an elf in the contest of words. Then they went on to Isengard, and the two bid farewell to the company and the remaining members of the Fellowship who had come north with them, going now into the Fangorn to see what they may, before going beyond and passing once more into their own lands. Gimli and Legolas accomplished many of their own deeds for a time, but their friendship, as any strong bond, lasted imperishable. Gimli and Legolas, as well as their people, aided, as they said they would, in rebuilding and improving Minas Tirith. Eventually, however, the time came after their dear friend Aragorn passed from this world, when Legolas built a ship in Ithilien, and with Gimli, elf friend, sailed down the Anduin and passed out of the world. It is said that in the year 120 of the Fourth Age, they went together to the Undying Lands, due to their friendship, which was greater than any other friendship between elf and dwarf. But Gimli also went to see Galadriel, who may have attained this grace for him, as he was the only dwarf to ever see Valinor in life. Gimli would spend the rest of his days in such a place with his best friend. And so the renowned and undying friendship of Legolas and Gimli came to the uttermost west, and so we come to the end of our tale. From the story of friendship between Legolas and Gimli, we see the virtue and strength of friendships, as well as their importance. In times of light and darkness, friends show us we are not alone, both in our victories and our defeats. Specifically, Legolas and Gimli depict how people from different backgrounds and cultures can still be the most unlikely of friends, who teach each other new things and show just how similar they actually are. Thank you all so much for watching, I really appreciate it. If you enjoyed this video, please hit that like button and share this with a friend. What are your thoughts, questions, additions, and corrections about the tale of friendship between Legolas and Gimli? Let me know in the comments below. This is one of the greatest and most heartfelt friendships in the Legendarium, and it means a lot to me whenever I encounter it. Please check out our music channel, Facebook, Twitter, merch, and Patreon for a podcast and Discord server. Links are in the description below. A huge shout out to our Valor 2 patrons over on Patreon: Adrian De La Tour, Chris Ortner, Peter Shepard, Kyle Wetzel, Lane Grimes, Mr. Vatnadal, Samuel McBee, and Jonathan Putnam. Thank you guys so much, it really means a lot to me. Finally, don't forget to subscribe and hit that bell button to join the Men of the West and all of the Free Peoples today, and I'll see you all again next week with a region spotlight on Helm's Deep. Everyone, take care, and as always, thank you all so much for joining me on this adventure. Until the next one, my great friends.